Sent. Great. So my name is Josh Morrison. I'm executive director of One Day Sooner, and I live in Brooklyn, New York. I've been, I would say, sort of interested in or kind of part of the effective altruist community. I would say for about 10 years now. I would say sort of like mid 20s. Um, and I guess what I'll kind of for today's talk. I'm going to talk for I hope about 15 to 20 minutes, but I do tend to be a bit long-winded. And I'll start with really talking about what are COVID-19 challenge trials? Why do we at One Day Sooner think they will be useful now? Why do we think they'd be really useful at the beginning of the pandemic? And then if I have time, I'll also try to talk a bit about why didn't challenge trials happen in 2020 for COVID, and what the sort of broader mission of One Day Sooner is, where we see things going in the future. And then finally, how does One Day Sooner fit into effective altruism? And maybe talking a little bit about my own connection to effective altruism. Okay, so starting with challenge trials. So what are challenge trials? Challenge trials are when you are deliberately exposed to an infectious agent as a way of learning about a disease or testing a drug or vaccine or other treatment. So these studies have been used in a lot of different diseases. They're used widely for influenza and malaria, RSV, which is a respiratory syncytial virus, which causes a lot of kind of colds, but also more serious diseases, especially in children. And then typhoid, cholera, a number of different diseases. And the well, I guess I'll say a little more about the kind of history of challenge studies because it's quite interesting. Before they were called challenge studies, but before we even had that term, the history of vaccination and of our understanding of infectious disease is really bound up in this challenge study idea. The sort of the first vaccine in some ways, the smallpox vaccine developed by Edward Jenner in the late 18th century, that was actually tested via what I think we would now call a challenge trial, where he inoculated I think it was an 8-year-old or 7-year-old child, his gardener's son, with the smallpox vaccine, and then tried to deliberately sort of deliberately exposed him to smallpox to see if the vaccine worked. And on the one hand, this shows how important and valuable challenge trials can be because they were, involved in this really important thing of developing this vaccine, this amazingly important smallpox vaccine. On the other hand, obviously we would never think today that it's ethical to deliberately expose a child to smallpox, even if you thought the vaccine was probably going to work. And so it shows the ethical complexity there. Another example that's I think less discussed, but I think in some ways equally interesting, is at the early 20th century. I can't remember the exact year, around 1900 or so. They were trying to figure out what caused yellow fever. They being, I think, the U.S. Army. And so Walter Reed, the Walter Reed Medical Center, some of you, I guess people outside the U.S. probably haven't heard of it, but sort of the major medical center for the military in DC, is named after Walter Reed, who was leading this research into yellow fever. And part of the reason for that was because they were trying to build the Panama Canal, and yellow fever was killing so many people in building it that it was proving impossible to do, and they were trying to figure out what to do. And so the way that they learned, one of their hypotheses, which turned out to be true for what caused yellow fever, was that it was caused by mosquito, that it was the vector was mosquitoes, would bite people and then cause the yellow fever. And so they did a test, they did a challenge trial of exposing people to these mosquitoes that thought had yellow fever. And particularly there was a doctor educated at Hopkins, Jesse Lazier, who did this. And by doing it, discovered, and he self-experimented, he had the challenge himself, was infected with yellow fever, proved that it was caused by mosquitoes, which led to a lot of kind of demosquitoification efforts around the Panama Canal, causing there to be, allowing the canal to be built, saving tens of thousands of lives alone for that. And so this is important research, and he died. For doing that. He died of yellow fever that he got in this study, and it was kind of covered up that he had done this as part of a medical study and just hadn't happened accidentally. So I know it's a decent amount of time to devote to those two historical examples, but I think it shows, a few different things. It shows a lot of common features that recur in our current consideration of challenge studies for COVID-19, which is basically that these studies can be incredibly valuable, not only for developing vaccines, but also for learning about really important things about a disease. Um, but that their ethics are have always been problematic and have always been sort of a limiting factor, and that the sort of how they're talked about, the kind of transparency around them, has always been a tricky issue to navigate, particularly in the example of Jesse Lazier. And so I'm not going to continue too much on the historical path here, but I'll just say throughout the 20th century, there were a number of different challenge studies, particularly for flu, for example. People were doing challenge studies for flu, I think, starting in the 1930s. And the way that we know what are called the correlates of protection for the flu vaccine, the things that we know that if the flu vaccine produces it in someone, it means it's going to work. It means your body is going to protect, your immune response is going to be effective. Those were discovered with challenge studies. Those were discovered by deliberately infecting people. And then there was also, from I think the 1950s to the 1980s in England, that was called the Common Cold Research Unit, where they did all this research on colds by deliberately infecting. I think it ended up being tens of thousands of people with colds. The challenge model for malaria was established in the 1970s. And there have been other challenge models for all sorts of diseases established since then. And so I kind of say this is a type of study that's really has a long history, that's really important. So the question then, you sort of fast forward to COVID-19. Well, what makes COVID-19 different? And I think there's sort of two basic things that are kind of important about it. The most obvious thing is that it's a potentially deadly disease that we don't have a cure, a reliable cure for. So, when they were testing malaria when they were creating the challenge model for malaria, we have it's a deadly disease, but we have a cure for it. Or the same thing with like typhoid, for example. And there's other diseases that are also can be deadly, like influenza or like RSV, that we do challenge studies, but they're usually not deadly. You don't think of the flu, even like something like H1N1, even pandemic flu, as being something that's like, oh wow, that's gonna be a really severe disease, especially if you're young and healthy in general. Whereas for COVID, I think it's both the case that COVID is dangerous, especially in older people, and and this goes to the second thing that's unique about it, is trying to develop this challenge model during a pandemic and trying to use it, and which we failed to do, we ended up doing, to test vaccines in the sort of acute phase of the pandemic before any vaccines were available. And that's important, I think, to know, because it creates this immense uncertainty that around, how severe is this disease, what are the long-term consequences, things like that, that both make challenge studies potentially quite useful, but also that make them, ethically complicated and make them concerning. And so it makes people worry about implementing them. Okay, so that's sort of going to this kind of historical thing. And the question is, okay, well, how could challenge studies be used for COVID-19 in the future, and how could they have been used sort of in the pandemic in general? So the first thing that challenge studies are helpful with is this idea about learning fundamental facts about the disease. And why are they helpful for that? Well, if you think about it, the way that we learn about SARS-CoV-2 and COVID now is really imperfect, because we only know that someone has COVID like days after they've been exposed, and probably if they're actually being seen by a medical professional, it's probably days after they've begun having symptoms usually, or at least maybe it's when you've been tested. But what you don't get with that kind of natural history studies, or with kind of regular epidemiology, is you don't get to observe up close what the immune system does and what the body does with the disease does from the moment of infection. And that scientifically is very valuable, because, for example, one thing you can see is, well, some people, when they're exposed to a certain amount of an infectious agent, some of them get sick and get infected, and some of them don't. Now, what differentiates those two people? That's a really useful thing to know about when you're designing treatments, when you're designing vaccines, and when you're testing vaccines. Because if you know, for example, that vaccine, that any time someone has, for example, a certain amount of neutralizing antibodies already, that means they won't be infected. You then can say that's what's called a correlate of protection. And therefore, you can say, okay, well, if this vaccine produces this correlative protection, that means that we know it's going to work. And so we don't have to wait to see if it's actually going to be effective, because we know scientifically that whenever people produce this correlative protection, then they're not getting infected. So these scientific discoveries can be really, really important and really helpful for vaccine development. And the studies that have just been approved are first to learn some of those scientific elements, right? What is the minimum infectious dose of how people get infected by SARS-CoV-2 with COVID? And then what happened, if you are taking, serum or sera from people, 3 times a day for the first, like what happens in their body as things are going along, and how does that correlate with severe disease? How does viral shedding work? How does that can tell us things about transmission, things like that. So that's one of the things that these current studies, these first challenge studies are meant to do. The second thing they're meant to do is to produce what's called the challenge model. Which means, the reason they call this a challenge model, and the more kind of academically used term at this point is actually not challenge studies. It's like a controlled human infection studies, or controlled human infection model. And the reason for that is it's how do we test vaccines if we're just starting with a vaccine? What might we do? Well, we can test it in animals, right? So that's called an animal model. So the animal isn't a perfect proxy for how a vaccine or how a treatment or how a disease might work in people. But you can test it on the animal, and an animal, you can observe it up close. You can do all sorts of things, and that's a model, an imperfect model, but it's a model for how it can work in people. Now, similarly, challenge studies produce a challenge, or use a challenge model. It's not the same thing as being infected naturally, because if you're, let's say, for example, you live with your spouse, and your spouse gets sick, has COVID, and then you're infected, you end up being infected by them. So if you think about that, your exposure happens in all sorts of ways at all sorts of times with like different amounts and things like that. That's different than what happens in a challenge study, where traditionally you're given one exposure. There's like in this case for COVID, there'll be like a nasal dropper with like a set amount of SARS-CoV-2 in it that's going to like go in your nose directly. That's a little bit different, right? So it's a model of human infection, but it's not the same as natural infection. And you can't, if what you want to do, and we'll get to this in just a second, if what you want to do is to test vaccines, particularly vaccines, but also therapeutics, in this challenge model, you can't jump right to that in your first step, because you don't know what usually would infect someone, right? So you don't know, if let's say you give people 100 virion, viral, I'm not going to 100 sort of viral units, and give them the vaccine. Then if they don't get sick, is that because the vaccine works, or is that because that's just not the right infectious dose? So the first thing you do is you do this study to determine what the right infectious dose is, to see what normally happens, and that creates this infection model. So then you can use that model, and that model can be very helpful. And in particular, what you can do with that model, so what they try to do is they try to get an infectious dose that would infect about something like 80% of people who are exposed to it normally. And that way, so let's imagine now we want to test a vaccine. So usually, and test and see if the vaccine is more, if it's actually effective in reducing infection and reducing symptoms and things like that. So usually what we do is we give that vaccine to a lot of people, to 20,000, 30,000 or more people now in some of these large phase 3s. And most of those people, half of those people are going to get the vaccine, half of them are going to get a placebo that's not effective. Most of those people are not going to be infected over the course of the study whether or not they get the vaccine, because it's not like 100% of people get infected with COVID every week. Instead, maybe 1 to 2% of people are getting infected every month. And so really what you're learning when you're comparing your control group to your treatment group is the actual number of people in those different groups who are actually the relevant thing you're comparing, people who actually are getting infected or would get infected in the absence of the vaccine. The actual numbers there are something like 50 people on each side, or 30 or 50 people, something like that. So if you in a challenge model, you can get to those numbers much more quickly. Let's say you just take 100 people that you vaccinated before, you dose them with your minimum infectious dose, and all of a sudden you have, there should be 40 people who've been infected in your control group, and you can compare that to your treatment group. So it's really a way of testing vaccines a lot more quickly. And it's an imperfect way of testing them because, again, it's not the same as natural infection. And also, it's people who are young and healthy, so you're reducing the risk. But at the same time, it is a really useful test because it's probably true that if, the vaccine reduces disease by 90% in a young, healthy population, it's probably going to be pretty useful in a healthy population, or in a regular population. And that's something that you can kind of find out ahead of time, and it can drive all sorts of decisions. You could say, well, we're in a pandemic. Maybe does make sense to have emergency use for maybe just 18 to 30-year-olds. Or maybe it changes how, if we know, for example, that let's say that we knew months ahead of time that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines were going to be as effective as they were, or that we thought they might be. We might have put more resources into manufacturing for those, as opposed to the Merck and Sanofi vaccine candidates, which did not prove to be effective. So that's the basic case for how to kind of use challenge studies. And right now we're at this interesting phase of the pandemic where we have a number of useful vaccines, and that it's not that every vaccine candidate has proven effective, but that it has not been, we've been kind of luckier, I think, than we could have hoped. I think most people did not think that the first vaccines would have 90-95% effectiveness. People thought it might be like a flu vaccine, so maybe if we're lucky, 50 to 70% effectiveness. And so the question, why should we still do these studies? Well, I think that there's sort of two things. So I think on the one, so there's two things to think about this. One is that all of our vaccines right now are focused, just about all of them are focused on one particular thing, which is the spike protein. And obviously we've seen mutations. Like, it might be a good idea to learn more about the disease, to develop vaccines, develop treatments that are going to be useful in the kind of more endemic stage of COVID. And the way I think of this fundamentally is that I think of the challenge model as kind of a useful scientific tool, and that given the enormous scale of suffering that COVID has created, any useful scientific tool is incredibly important to develop. And that can be for developing vaccines that are going to, sort of future vaccines that are easier to distribute, that have less of a cold chain requirement, are one dose instead of two, can be orally delivered or intranasally delivered instead of delivered with a shot. It can also be increasing our understanding of the disease, so we can develop vaccines that could last longer, could be based on different mechanisms of action, so that they could avoid mutation, evasion by mutation, and things along those lines. So those are, let me think. I realized I had wanted to cover some of these other topics about, well, let me just quickly, I'll do a bit of a kind of lightning round on some of the other things I was gonna cover before starting taking questions. And then if people want me to go more into depth, I can. So then one question, okay, so why did, I'm saying all these great things about challenge studies, and that they could have sped up vaccine development, they could have taught us all these things about the disease. Why didn't we, develop these immediately, really urgently from the beginning? And so obviously, I think there's the, kind of substantive ethical case that people had concerns and I think reasonable concerns. And there's sort of the political case of, well, why do those concerns outweigh actually developing the model earlier? And so the ethical concerns, I would put them into two basic categories. One category are concerns about the people in the studies themselves, and the other is about the sort of wider social harms or potential harms of doing the studies. So the concerns for the study themselves are, look, it's really fairly risky to be, even for a young healthy person, someone 20 to 30, it's fairly risky to be infected by SARS-CoV-2. And there's a lot of uncertainty about it as well. And that uncertainty has declined over the course of the pandemic. So now we can feel pretty confident that the chance of someone who might be eligible for the study dying is clearly less than 1 in 10,000. And the chance of having disease severe enough to be hospitalized is clearly less than 1 in 1,000. But that wasn't necessarily obvious the whole pandemic. And there was, I think that data is consistent. There's a good paper in the Lancet Journal of Infectious Disease that had some good estimates of the potential mortality among people in that population that is roughly in line with that. And I think that came out in maybe April or May. But we know a lot more now than we did then. And then obviously there's also this risk of long COVID, which we still can't fully understand because we don't know what's going to happen in 10 years, right? And so that creates one issue. And some people made the argument that because of this major uncertainty, and because this challenge model it's not a panacea, it's not going to immediately, you can't completely license all these vaccines on the basis of this. You need to still be doing safety studies. There needs to be time to set up this model. Given all that, some people felt like, look, the risks are not to these individuals are not high and are too high, and the rewards are not low enough, and so it's not ethical to proceed for that, and people can't necessarily understand the choice they're making. So that's one ethical argument. You can sort of imagine, our response to that, I think, is sort of twofold, which is that, one, we think that, and this is the name of the organization, that even very small gains in vaccination and in stopping COVID and understanding COVID, things like that, even, even one day can represent, 10,000 people's lives. And so if you compare that against people who are choosing to go into the studies and, have maybe a 1 in 10,000 chance of death, and let's just for the moment say a 1 in 1,000, 1 in 100 chance of a long-term consequence, then that seems worth it. The second thing we say is that we're a sort of liberal, sort of small L liberal organization. We believe in people's right to choose and make decisions about their own lives. And if people want to do these studies, we think it's important to be deferring to those people. There's a second ethical argument. This is an argument that the World Health Organization really emphasized in a meeting they had in December, which you can read a little bit about in the Guardian, which is that they felt like there's a concern that, well, look, there's so much vaccine hesitancy, there's so much nervousness and concern about vaccines, and if you're deliberately infecting people, that creates a lot of different dangers around vaccine hesitancy and vaccine confidence. For example, one, what if something goes wrong, right? So maybe it's a small chance that someone dies in a study, but if someone does, what if there's going to be huge rumors that that's how vaccines work and that lots of people are going to die, or what if it prevents challenge studies from being used in the future? But even if something doesn't go wrong, just the mere fact of infecting people with a disease deliberately, that could in some way lead to these different rumors that could damage this really important goal of vaccine confidence. And I think that's there's a reason why the World Health Organization, who has been generally kind of supportive of challenge studies overall, I would say, in a mild and complex sort of way, and I think their record on the issue's been fairly good, despite our disagreements. I think that's a cogent point. But my feeling about this is that it's about the importance of progress, and it's the importance of not getting stuck in a sort of kind of local minima of saying, well, we know there's this big problem of vaccine confidence and vaccine hesitancy, and if we just say, well, therefore, there's research that we all agree would be useful scientific research to do that would extend the frontiers of human knowledge, that like would be actually, if people understood it properly, a good thing to happen. And it just seems wrong to me to get stuck in, well, we can just never do that, because we have these sort of hard to quantify, hard to understand, or when I say hard to understand, I don't mean that it's hard to understand why someone would have this fear, but it's the relationship between those useful studies and this potential fear, potential vaccine hesitancy. We don't understand it enough to really be able to kind of nail down what the actual effect is. That just seems to me wrong to sort of cramp our scientific tools that we have available in our future scientific progress based on fears of things that we don't have a grip on, right? And I think the right answer to me is that we need to be learning to do these studies as ethically as possible and publicly show that they're as ethical as possible, and learn more about the causes of vaccine hesitancy and vaccine confidence so that we can understand where are the risks and how to avoid them. I think that having these uncertain concerns and using that to be phobic of research that's valuable, I think that's misguided. And so this gets to the piece of, well, what is one day sooner? What are we trying to accomplish? Obviously in a direct way, we were trying to, we're trying to accomplish getting the vaccine, ending the pandemic one day sooner. But fundamentally what we are is actually something a bit more complicated than that. We're a bit more complicated than a group that just advocates for COVID-19 challenge studies or challenge studies in general. What we're actually trying to do is to advocate for the research participants themselves, starting with people who want to be in these challenge studies, some of whom, like AB and Alistair and Elaine and Yele and me are on this call. And yeah, there's several people, and I keep listing names. But also people who are in, in challenge studies, in other types of high impact research in the future, because we think that the way the kind of bioethics system works will be improved if research participants have some sort of collective representation, a sort of union for research participants, or maybe kind of a liberal union for research participants. And the goal of this union, or the goal of One Day Sooner, is not to improve the material interest. It's not like a union in the sense that we're not trying to, as our primary goal, improve the material interests of our members. We do have opinions about compensation. Sean McPartlin and I just published a piece in the American Journal of Bioethics about compensation. We commissioned, that's a response to a piece we commissioned about compensation for challenge volunteers. But we think that our main goal is this idea of expanding the frontiers of science, and because we think that science will be better, that medical research, biological research will be better if the research participants are empowered, and that the best way of empowering, at least one good way of empowering research participants, is to be collectively representing those participants in the same way that it is helpful to improve the status of labor to be collectively representing labor. We think that One Day Sooner is an organization that can advocate on our volunteers' interests more effectively than any given volunteer can advocate for their own interest without One Day Sooner. So that's kind of the goal of us as an organization, and we think that it has broad applicability beyond COVID-19 challenge studies, beyond challenge studies in general. I think it's something that, I hope that we're successful enough that, in 10 years from now, we'll be kind of the union of research participants. But I also think that what I hope to see is that in, 10 years from now, I think that if there ever is, if we are, either we or someone else is effective at representing research participants collectively, and having an organization whose job it is in the ethics system, in the medical research system, to represent participants, I think it will seem primitive that we didn't have it before. It'll seem strange that we ever did it any other way. And sort of odd that we just thought that the best way of helping research participants was through kind of these like research ethics committees to kind of act on their behalf, but not be sort of representing them in some sort of direct sense. So that's kind of why One Day Sooner. Now, finally, how does One Day Sooner fit into effective altruism? So I think that, I mean, so in one, there's a few different answers to this question, in part because any movement is, you can't kind of quite pin it down. It's not just one, it's not just an idea, it's not just a group of people, it's a lot of different things. One thing is that the early history of One Day Sooner is tied up very closely to the effective altruist movement. A lot of the early people who were involved, including myself and AB and Julia, who are kind of three of the four first employees. And then I think also, we're people who would ourselves identify as effective altruists. It was funded, our first work was funded by Open Philanthropy, which is also uniquely tied to effective altruism and funds other work by, for example, the Center for Effective Altruism, promoting that. And it also, it's kind of personally builds off of work that I had done with kidney donors, basically a similar theory. My organization, Weightless Zero, which the theory being that if kidney donors had more power in the transplant system, then donors would get more benefits, more people would donate. So it's a similar theory, which was also funded actually before Open Philanthropy was Open Philanthropy, and it was GiveWell Labs that sort of funded that work. And then a lot of the people, who the first person to share, the first public mention, I think, of One Day Sooner was, I think it was before we even had the name One Day Sooner, was by Rob Wiblin on his Facebook page at 80,000 Hours, and then Dylan Matthews at Vox in his Future Perfect newsletter. So these, and then I think at Vox, the podcast by Noam Hassenfeld, whose brother Eli Hassenfeld founded GiveWell. So it's a very like EA movement, like emanation of the EA movement, just from like a sociological perspective. I think that there are, I don't want to go on too long this because I know I'm a bit over time, so I'll stop in a second to take questions. But I think that this question of, what does it mean to be an effective altruist organization? What does it mean to be part of the EA movement? I think that can mean different things to different people. And the last thing I would say before taking questions is, I think it's important that EA be a liberal movement. That is, that it's a movement that lots of different ideas can flourish, and even ideas that people can disagree about. And because I think it's, I think that challenge days are a great idea. I think that it would have been great if they were done a lot earlier. I think it could have saved many, many lives. I think it still will save, COVID challenge days will save people's lives. But I think it's also would be completely reasonable for someone who's an effective altruist to think, you know what, I don't think challenge days are a good idea. Or I think also it'd be reasonable to say, well, I don't know if like, challenge days being associated with the EA, as a movement is like something we should be trying to do. But I think it's important that different people who feel motivated by EA, by effective altruist principles, are empowered to try lots of different things, and not to and to be able to identify publicly as EA is doing that. And so I think in that sense, I do feel like One Day Sooner is a kind of effective altruist organization. Not, and I think of it, I think it'd be really arrogant for us to say, oh, well, we're so effective, and that's why we're an effective altruist organization. I think we're an effective altruist organization in the sense that we're motivated by the principles of effective altruism and aspire to those principles. Okay, so sorry for going on a bit long. What questions do people have? And you can also just like ask them. I think it's a small enough group.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Josh. This has been lovely. Yeah, now it's the time for the public Q&A. And there are like two ways of asking questions. You can just type them in the chat if you want to. Or, so we don't mingle all at the same time, just use the raise hand feature maybe, and I will call the names, or Josh will call the names so we can see it. Yeah, feel free to ask question which way suits you the best. Okay. So in the meantime, while we wait for questions roll away, and Josh, I do have the first one. Let's just say you would be running the FDA. What would you do? And how much earlier could we have been if you've been the CEO of FDA?
Well, I think the FDA has a very hard problem in a couple of different ways. One way is that, our attention and the world's attention is on the FDA because of this one disease and this one pandemic. But they have to have rules and a system to respond not even just to pandemics or infectious disease, but to all sorts of drugs. And so it's the situation they're confronted with of being being too strict or needing to move really fast is a different situation than they're usually confronted with, which is that usually the problem is there's enormous commercial motivation to get drugs approved, and they have to be the ones saying, no, stop, this isn't good enough. So I do think that the first thing I just want to say is that I think that it's, there's sort of kind of object level things that the FDA could be maybe doing differently in a useful way. But that I certainly don't think I would do a better job at running the FDA than people who do it. And I also think that, I haven't worked closely with the folks who are at the FDA now. I have gotten a chance to work with a couple of people, Norman Baylor, who used to run the Office of Vaccine Research at the FDA, and Luciano Barrio, who was one of Biden's COVID advisors and used to be chief scientist at the FDA. And I've been very impressed. Anyway, it's maybe a bit too long a preamble, but I think that there's a couple of things that might be good to do differently. So first, just on like a specific challenge study level, I think it would have been good to create. I think that it's I completely understand why they had the orientation they had, which is, fundamentally they're kind of a reactive agency. People apply to them with stuff, and then they render decisions. That's their mode. They can give guidance. They do give guidance about things. I think it might have been more useful for them to get, in a perfect world, if I were running the FDA, particularly thinking on the challenge study line, I think it would have been good for them to early on give guidance of, here's the way that challenge studies will and will not affect our decisions for emergency use authorization and licensure. And specifically, I think that I think a few things that would have been useful. One is to clarify that if something proved effective in a challenge study in like 18 to 30-year-olds, let's say, to say like we, assuming that there's safety and things like that, but like we would use that efficacy data for giving an emergency use authorization for that population, right? I think that would be something that would have been helpful. Another thing that would have been helpful is, maybe this is very narrow, but the ideas of to do a challenge study, you first need to prepare the virus, and you prepare it to a much higher standard if it's going into humans than you would if it's going into animals. And just in a very narrow sense, like we were trying to get, and the FDA has to kind of opine on that. We were trying to get some FDA guidance on like what would constitute this what's called good manufacturing practice, and whether the procedures that some of our vendors wanted to use for it would work. And that proved to be difficult, and that difficulty and the delay in that actually prevented us from doing our own like GMP. When I say our own, I mean like through a vendor who's an expert, but funding our own GMP process that I think could have been quite useful. And I think on the one hand, you sympathize because they're enormously bandwidth constrained, there's enormous amount of things coming at them. But I do think that is a small thing that would have been useful. And the final thing that would have been useful, really specifically on the challenge study side, is I'm aware of at least one major vaccine manufacturer who was interested in challenge studies and chose not to do them because their ethics committee felt like they didn't see the benefit side of this would lead to licensure, or lead to emergency use authorization. And if there had been clear guidance about that, I think you would have seen that group do challenge studies. And specifically, and this might be too in the weeds, but I know the plan that because their scientific team really liked this idea and really wanted to move forward. Had used challenge studies in the past, wanted to move forward with using them. And what they would have done is what's called an immunologic bridging study, which is you take a vaccine that works, and you do a challenge where some people is the vaccine that works, some people get the placebo, some people get the vaccine that you're trying to test, and you see, one, is it effective, and two, is it the same mechanism of action? Can you produce the same correlates of protection I've talked about? And so that combined with maybe more of a discussion of what the correlates of protection, what would have to qualify to be correlates of protection. Okay, so that's kind of some specific challenge study stuff. I think the other thing, there's two other areas that at the moment, and this is sort of stepping a little bit outside of my the hat that I have some actual expertise in, which is challenge studies, to kind of more like general pundity thoughts about the pandemic. But I think there's two things that a lot of that to me seem like clearly good ideas. One is the kind of first doses first strategy of saying, we should be giving people, as many people as possible, the first dose, and then waiting to give them the second dose for about 3 months or so until there's more supply. I think that would have saved a lot of lives and could honestly still save lives. And I think that's not purely an FDA decision, but I think that there's things the FDA could have done to advance that. And the other thing is, I think that there should be more of a vehicle for a sort of right to try um, for vaccines, particularly in a pandemic context, that have proven safety and where have also proven immunogenicity, but where the FDA hasn't finished their review of efficacy. So AstraZeneca, I think that the three examples right now in the US would be AstraZeneca, Novavax, and Johnson & Johnson. All of those, I think, have proven enough safety and enough efficacy that it would be a good idea that anyone who wants, who's willing to sign a waiver to say, look, this hasn't gotten formal FDA emergency use authorization, but I'm not eligible for the other ones. I really want to take this one. I think that would be a useful mechanism to have, because I think that might have accelerated actually deploying those vaccines. And in particular, I don't understand, and this is even getting more into the pundity side where I have less expertise. Given the amount of evidence that I don't understand why you need to do a Novavax study in the US when there's also a decent Novavax study elsewhere in order for people to be getting what looks like a very effective vaccine with Novavax. So those are my FDA thoughts, some of which are not very informed.
Awesome. Thanks for that. Yeah. Are there any questions in the room? Feel free to just raise your hands or text them in the chat. There is one raised hand. That's Lauro. Feel free. Go ahead.
Cool. Thanks. Thanks, Josh, for the intro and for the presentation. It was super interesting. I'd like to ask another question that's sort of in the vein of why haven't challenge trials been done sooner? Why weren't they done? And specifically, I've been thinking about why this was, and I'm curious if you agree that it must be something that's sort of general to the scientific process or vaccine procurement process in lots of different countries, because of this kind of surprising fact that not only were challenge trials not done in the US or in one single country, but in our country. So yeah, what do you think are are there structural reasons you have identified that hinder challenge trials, and what are they?
Yep, that's a great question, because one I've seen a few places, and so basically the question I think is, or to me the most interesting version of the question is, okay, there's like lots of countries with fairly advanced medical systems. Why did none of if it's a good idea, if challenge trials are a good idea, why did none of these countries do them, right? And I think there's the main answer to this question is that only a few countries have the challenge trials are kind of because of the ethical complexity and because you're deliberately infecting people. There's only a few places that do them commonly. And do them in such a have the sophistication that they would want to move forward with them. And so you might think, so in particular, the U.S., particularly the efforts led by the NIH so like NIAID, the National Institute of autoimmune infectious disease, I think, or allergy infectious disease. So that's kind of a center of challenge studies in the U.S. And then there are these vaccine treatment and evaluation units in the U.S., about 10 different universities like Maryland and Emory that are expert at it. And so in the US, I think it's actually kind of simple. I think that this might sound sort of conspiratorial or too personalistic. I think that Dr. Fauci, who has done a lot of really great things, decided that he didn't think that challenge studies were a useful thing to do. I think, or useful might be not quite the word, but we said that the NIAID should not support challenge studies in the US until, unless the early vaccines failed. I think there's a lot of reasons for that decision. I think one thing is to say is that the US has generally been more conservative about challenge studies than England has, which I'll get to in a second. And we sort of stopped our influenza challenge program between 2000 and 2010 because of basically one severe adverse event that didn't seem to have long-term consequences for the person involved. So that's, and then I think also in the US, there was at least one institute. I know that Emory was interested in potentially doing challenge studies, but they and no one else wanted to do them in the absence of backing from the NIH. The kind of PR issues, controversy, litigation, like there's stance in the scientific community, all those sorts of things. And I think also it also filtered into when we had a couple different vendors to produce the virus that could have been moving more quickly, that would have been in the US. It did seem like there was some hesitation that ultimately proved fatal because of the US government's attitude. The other places, some other, so there's also England, and because England, like I said, has this long history of challenge study use, and places like Oxford and Imperial and the University of Southampton, I think the London School of Tropical Medicine, have done these studies quite a bit to do vaccination in the developing world and perhaps elsewhere. And so they were in some ways the ones with either the most sophistication or or as much sophistication as the NIH. And so they did end up moving forward with challenge studies, but it just took a really long time. So why is that? And then why did other countries do them? I think it's basically that. So I'll give kind of two big, maybe two sets of reasons. And I think they're both related to, so one set of reasons is this, what I would say is kind of the proliferation of veto points that exist. Because it's interesting to note that the only entities that really that ultimately national governments needed to be heavily involved in doing this. And that naturally makes people more conservative, because like, what politician during a pandemic is going to be excited to deliberately infect their citizens with a disease, right? So like you need, in order for challenge study to go forward, you don't need permission from just like one institution. You need permission from like multiple levels of not just like, let's say it's Imperial, or let's say it's Oxford who's conducting the study, but also like all the way up through their national administration, even at like very high levels, right? And so and then also even globally, you need the WHO to also kind of be relatively okay with it. And so even when you get, early in May, I believe, or maybe it was in April, you get WHO ethics guidance that says basically, yes, these studies could be okay. Not like, wow, this is the most, but just like, this is like a reasonable thing. Like there's no clear barriers. And then in June, you get a study that's like, okay, here's the roadmap for how you would do these. That's not enough. You need to then get, your own entity and your own country and things like that. And so there's just this like, so another example of this is that so Adrian Hill at Oxford, who runs the Jenner Institute, is one of the main people behind their vaccine. He was very enthusiastic about these studies publicly as of like July or August, I think. And but there was clearly disagreement at Oxford. Sarah Gilbert, another person who was working on the vaccine, did not like the studies. And I think internally it's not, even though Adrian Hill runs the Jenner Institute, you don't need just that institute. You need the sort of Oxford as a whole. And it turns out you don't need Oxford as a whole. You need the British government as a whole. And so this is sort of like, you just need a lot of people to say yes. And that introduces friction at every stage, and it slows things down at every stage. And because there's this reputational risk of like deliberately infecting people, there's always going to be, there's always a decent reason to say no. And people naturally on a kind of a spectrum of being conservative and wanting to move slow versus being progressive and open-minded. And so there's always going to be people who are like, well, maybe we shouldn't deliberately infect people with a deadly disease at each institution. And you kind of need to like go through all those. That's one area. The second thing is uncertainty, by which I mean, because I might say uncertainty and complexity, which is that, the simple case for challenge studies is, well, look, you can infect, like, look how fast they can be. You can infect a bunch of people really quickly, you test the vaccine, and then you get your results in a month. But actually, it's scientifically, like a lot of things with immunology and vaccines, it's scientifically complicated where, well, you can't quite do it right away, right? You need to do this viral production process first, and then you need to create the challenge model with the infectious dosing study. And those things, like how long do those take? That different scientists have different estimates of how long those take. And so the problem ends up becoming sort of like fractally complex. And it's not that the logic doesn't end up making sense, but it's at each stage when each like piece of it introduces this like additional informational burden and this additional like uncertainty from a decision perspective. And so there's always going to be like a reason to say no. And so that kind of slows me down. And the last thing I'll say from an uncertainty perspective is that you would like my natural assumption with the pandemic was when you have this extraordinary event is going to lead to an extraordinary response, and so people are going to be more open-minded to trying new aggressive approaches than they would be otherwise. And maybe in some ways that's true, but I think in a lot of ways it's when there's so much uncertainty, when you're faced with this new and terrifying reality that just changes everything, people's natural reaction is not to think, oh, let me like amp up the uncertainty by being aggressive, even if it's maybe a good idea in certain contexts. People, I think, actually retreat from that and think, okay, let's be sort of tried and true. And so I think that the reality is just there was the default approach to pandemics was not like, oh, let's create a challenge model whenever there's a pandemic. So I think that proved too difficult for us to overcome. That like we were trying to change. We were trying to get something difficult accomplished in this time where people don't have a lot of bandwidth and things are really uncertain. I think our major goal from a using challenge studies in future pandemics is to try to create a path that is a default path to basically, whenever there's a pandemic, we should be preparing the virus as quickly as possible. We should be publishing a protocol as quickly as possible. There should be someone's job it is to try to do a challenge study. Not to say that there will always be ethical to do a challenge study, we'll always do a challenge study, but at least that we can that there's a set path that then goes forward and then presents the ethical question really squarely, rather than what we had where you have a lot of arguments about, well, is this really gonna be useful? Is it gonna be ready now? Is it gonna be ready later? What can they have? And all these different things. And that really slows things down and makes things difficult.
Awesome. Thanks for the answer. Josh, being aware that you gotta leave like in 2 minutes from now, but we got two lucky teammates of yours here who can continue answering the questions. Again,
all right, well,
thanks
so
for
having me. I'm sorry that I had to run. But yeah, really appreciate you thinking about these issues and hope this was an interesting conversation. Talk to you all soon.
Awesome, thanks. Abby,